All right, gentlemen, we're doing this. Chapter 12, Asia. We're going to start with China again. We started with the beginnings of China, with the Shang and the Zhou dynasties, and we're going to add four more dynasties. So at the top of your page, make sure you write down Chapter 12, Asia. Let's do this. Okay, now I have not had you do a timeline before, but because this unit's a little bit more complex, because we're going to add, like I said, four more dynasties, I think this is actually really useful for you. So what I would do is I'd draw a line, horizontal line, and I would put 618, which of course reflects 618 AD, and put the Tang dynasty begins. Then in the year 960, right, the Song dynasty begins. And then you want to put in the year, was it 1279, Kublai Khan conquers China, and his dynasty is the Yuan dynasty. Now we're going to talk about the Mongols. The Mongols are not Chinese. The Mongols are from Mongolia, this northern province north of China. They actually conquer China and they create their own Chinese dynasty. We'll talk about the reasons for that later, but you can put that one at 1279. And then you get the Ming dynasty at 1368. Now, if you notice, there's kind of a pattern. Chinese dynasties, at least during this era, really go about 300 years, with the exception of the Yuan dynasty. They really burn themselves out after about 300 years. So put this up in your notes. This will help. The idea is that we want to just start framing this into our heads so it's easier to just visualize this. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of words, Tang, Shang, Zhao. It's easier if we can just lay it out mentally. So put these down, and then when you're ready, you can move on to the rest of the video. Now let's start breaking up these dynasties so they make a bit of sense. How can we understand their significance? Okay, so the first of these new dynasties that we're going to add is the Tang dynasty. And the Tang dynasty is an important dynasty. The Tang, again, a dynasty is a ruling family. So the Tang are a ruling family that overthrow the previous dynasty and they create their dynasty. The leader goes by the name of Tang Tanzhong, which is why it's called the Tang dynasty. And he's actually very intelligent. He was a general of the previous dynasty, and that's very common in history, by the way. You're very likely, if you're going to be overthrown, first, if you're in charge of a country, you're very likely to be overthrown first by like a sibling who wants power, and then after that, really your military advisors or generals are very likely to overthrow you, because why? They already have a connection to the people that are required to defeat you, your soldiers. And so he overthrows it and he creates the Tang dynasty. A couple interesting things, and I've got to mention this one right off the bat. His wife's name is Wu Zhao, and what makes her fascinating is he had sons. And so when he dies, like almost all what normally would happen is one of his sons would take leadership. But actually, his wife, Wu Zhao, took leadership, even though she had sons and they were competent enough leaders. But because she was such a strong individual, she refused to give up power. And the reason why I say refuse is because in all of Chinese history, there has never been an empress and there will never be another empress. Wu Zhao is it. And so she takes over, and between her and her husband, and over the next 300 years, they expand the empire. And if you look on the map right now, you can see like China looks kind of like two dumbbells. There's two large chunks geographically on the map, and then you've got that area but which connects them. So China starts expanding its size and power as it goes. The larger your country is geographically, more access to resources and people that you have. Now, so what is it about this dynasty that that matters so much? So first of all, what the Tang do, and this they bring back this thing called the civil service exam. The civil service exam is a critical component to understanding Chinese history, and I would actually say that there's a connection to Asia overall. What China does, and specifically the Tang dynasty, is they put this exam in place called the civil service exam, and in order to be a part of the government, if you like wanted to be like a provincial leader or something, you would have to pass the test and do very well and beat out the other applicants. Then you could then be selected to be in charge of areas of China. And what you're like, well, that makes sense, Mr. Rico. Well, keep in mind, nobody did things like that at this time in history. This is a meritocratic system. That means only the smartest people, only the most knowledgeable people. That means you also have to be literate to have any chance of having power in China, other than, of course, the emperor. In order to have power, you had to pass this exam. And what this does is this actually creates a pretty strong ruling authority that understand things both about China and other parts of the world. And what it also does is it allows regular people who wanted to be a part of the Chinese government structure, who maybe want a better life for their family, it gives them an ability to move up. Anyone could take the exam. Now, let's keep in mind, it's not like it would be easy to do, because at this time in history, obviously most people are not literate. So not only do you have to be trained in literacy, but then you'd have to have tutors and people, teach you about the world, China, you know, trade policies, conceptions of how their economy works, all these things. But if you pass that exam and do well, you may move up. And that can actually change the life of not just you, but your entire family. Next is this is something that is near and dear to the heart of Americans. In the Tang Dynasty, they invent gunpowder. Now, keep in mind, guns back then weren't like Glocks. A gun back then, really, with gunpowder, is you'd have a big stick and a metal tube, and at the back of the tube you'd have gunpowder. Sometimes you'd have rocks or metal balls. You'd light it and you'd kind of hold it like a hand cannon and fire it in battle. But the Chinese very early on invent fireworks, gunpowder, mines where you could trigger them, or even grenades. And all of that comes from this invention that Americans love so much. And then obviously, and I kind of showed you a picture of this, they expand the size and the power of China. Specifically, they become geographically the largest country in the world. They become very large. Now, we have this idea as Americans, the countries only get bigger, and that's not true. But during the Tang Dynasty, they expand, get more access to resources, and a larger population. Now, Mr. Rico, well, what happens to the Tang Dynasty? You're saying they're awesome. Well, this same prevalent theme that you hear over time. As the dynasty goes on, you get future leaders in the family are less, let's say, less efficient. Maybe they're not as good. They have poor leadership qualities, and the family becomes more corrupt. That naturally happens as leaders are in power over long periods of time. And as that goes on, what do? They start taxing people more. The more they tax, the less connection that Chinese people feel toward their government. They start having more and more resentment, starts causing hardships. And there are more and more frequent attacks all over the Tang Dynasty coming from external sources. Remember, the larger your country is geographically, the larger the area that you have to defend. And by the year 907, the final Tang emperor is killed. And here comes the next dynasty. And what do they have to do to have the new dynasty? They have to claim the mandate of heaven. And who's going to do that? Well, that's going to be the Song Dynasty. But before we get to the Song Dynasty, I'm just going to show you a really quick. I want to show you what a civil service exam might look like. Now, this would actually be, this one is one of the last exams given. And so once you do, I've translated some of this over. Now, imagine being, a peasant, and here's a question that you're being asked. When Japan began its reforms, they employed Westerners, thus they became strong. Now Egypt has employed over 1,000 foreigners, but they ended up losing money and power and remains a weak state. Discuss the reasons behind that. Imagine being a Chinese citizen and being asked such a specific question about both your country, economic policy, and the world. This would be very difficult. And this is what you're doing. This is what you're competing with to move up. So let's talk about the Song Dynasty. So the Song Dynasty, we've talked about in Chinese history. The Song Dynasty, the Song family comes into power. They claim the mandate of heaven. They say, well, the gods no longer support you, Tang Dynasty rulers, because you've become corrupt and you're having all these problems. And so here comes the Song Dynasty. Sorry, my camera's sliding around a little bit. And so in the year 960, China now is coalesced under the Song, and they proclaim that their dynasty has begun. And it lasts about 300 years, much like the Tang Dynasty. Now, an interesting thing about in this internecine years, there's all this fighting. But when the Song actually unified China, it's smaller than it was. And if you look on that map, it shows you it's about half the size. And this is an important concept that you need to understand in history. Like Americans, again, we've seen our history of our country, it got bigger, 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 right? You have the original 13 colonies, you add more territory, Ohio territory, you had the Louisiana Purchase, country keeps expanding, you get the Mexican-American War, boom, boom, country gets bigger and bigger, you add Alaska, you add Hawaii, countries only get bigger. Not true at all. Countries often grow and shrink depending on how much territorial power they're able to project. Song Dynasty smaller, significantly smaller. China can't hold that territory. Now, what are the accomplishments of this dynasty? Why are we covering it? Why do we remember it? What's interesting about it? So let's go over that a bit. So what's interesting by the Song dynasty during this time period, China's population becomes the largest in the world. They become the most populous nation in the world. Look at this. So we're looking at the year like around 1000. China already has 100 million people at this point in history. And that's an amazing feat. You can have lots of people, but can you feed them? And this is really where you get a huge focus um, on China and especially other parts of Asia. Remember, large parts of China you can't farm, and so they really become dependent on this one specific grain. It uses more vertical space than horizontal. It uses large amounts of water, which China has, and that of course is rice. Rice is a calorically efficient grain, and like you just need large populations to pick into the individual seeds. So you need water, and you need large amounts of people, laborers, to work, and that's what China has, and they become more dependent on things like rice. Now, in the United States, where we have large tracts of land and we have a relatively small population per the land, we can have crops that grow horizontally. Like if you go from here to Cleveland, you can just look, it's like miles and miles and miles of cornfields and wheat fields. Those are horizontal crops, and we can do that because of our lower population density. But in places where you have large amounts of people, you need crops that don't use as much land but produce a lot of calories, and that's rice. And the Song dynasty booms. Now, there's two other things that I want to cover that are invented during this time. One is the movable type, and what do I mean by that? Look at the picture on the screen right now. So movable type are little slats that can be made of stone or metal, and sometimes wood. And what it is, imagine that you want to write a book. Now you can handwrite it, which is what everyone has done since time immemorial. You can handwrite. Or what you could do is you can create like letters, A, B, C, D. You can put them on little tiles, and you can put ink on it and press the page. That's called type. And people have come up with that idea for a long time, that you can carve it, and then every time you ink it, you can make a page. But what the Chinese do is, well, rather than to carve all the letters on a single block, why not just have individual letters that you can move around, or characters? So every time you ink them, you can press a page, move them again, and you can create a new page. This is a pretty big step forward, and it allows for more literature to be created, and more quickly. So you just you put all your characters, ink it, make the page, move them, ink it, make a new page, and you can get through book creation much quicker. And what this allows them to do, by the way, since they become masters of movable type, is to create the first paper money. Money is an important invention in human history, because think about how inefficient bartering is. Like, you want a pair of tennis shoes, I want like a chicken. We got to figure out, like, how does this work? What am I gonna? You're gonna trade me like half a shoe for half a chicken? Bartering is not efficient. The idea that money, which is this thing that we all agree that this piece of paper or this shell or whatever is a store of value. We all agree that this thing has the same value, and when we go somewhere, we can trade it rather than have to trade specific items. Money is a huge step forward, and the Chinese, because of their ability with movable type, become masters of this, and now their economy is much more efficient. We all don't need to figure out what goods have equal value. We can just trade the money instead. So that's what the Song Dynasty does. And that's what paper money would look like. Anytime we cover a country or a nation or a culture, you've probably noticed that one of the first things I'll do, especially if it's a different group, is that a group we haven't covered previously, is I like to put up these pyramids to show you like who has value in the society. So let's take a quick look at what China's, during the Song and Tang dynasty, what the how the society's hierarchy is. So draw this. I'd write these words and put this pyramid into your notes. So as China progresses into these dynasties, the power of noble families start to fade. This is a similar thing that happened in Europe. And who starts to get power? Well, first of all, the emperor still has power, right? He's on the top of society. But this new group of people with wealth start to become very important in the society. And the term for them, this new upper class, these people that have a little more money than they need to survive, are called the gentry. Well, who are they? Why do they matter? Why are you covering this, Mr. Rico? Well, the gentry matter because they are people that pass the civil service exam, and because they did that, they have extra money, and they can change not just their lives but the lives of their entire family. It gives them access to wealth and power, and through that they can change the lives of everyone else around them. And this is where this new class, and what it does, it almost acts as a safety valve for China, right? Because no matter how desperate your circumstances are, and keep in mind this is a time in history where starvation is very common, but there's always a chance that if someone in your family is able to do this through their own merit alone, they can change the destiny of everyone in your family. It's a big deal. Now, the last thing I want to cover is like who's on the bottom in Chinese society. Remember when we looked at India and we looked at the top, and you had like the Brahmins on top, and then you had the warriors and the merchants. And warriors were second in Indian society. But here, they're very low. Look, it's peasants and soldiers on the bottom. Now, why would that be? Why would a soldier, who's so many cultures, the soldiers are often in important classifications, why are they on the bottom? Can you think of any reason? Well, I'll give you one. And one is that when you have such a large population base, when you have so many people, soldiers become replaceable, right? Because if you have 100 million people and you get into a conflict and you have the largest population around, people are very replaceable. So soldiers in Chinese history at this time really don't have much, they don't convey much value. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the status of women in this society at this time. And through that, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this new custom that forms. And this custom is, of course, called foot binding. In this time period, to understand this, there's both the aesthetic and the functional that we need to talk about. So obviously, when you look at the picture, you kind of get an idea of what I'm going to be talking about. At this time in history, simply put, women with smaller feet were considered much more sexually attractive. They'd have higher sexual market value. They were considered more beautiful, the smaller the feet. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this, but the first reason I have to say is the practical function. The smaller your feet, the less work you could do. So I want you to consider this. Say Mrs. Rico has the tiniest feet ever. She has tiny, really not functional feet. You're like, well, that's not useful. Well, that's the point. Because imagine that Mrs. Rico's feet are so small that she can't even walk from place to place. Well, that means she'll die. No, it doesn't. If my wife has the tiniest feet on the street, how is she getting from place to place? Well, Mr. Rico's making sure she gets there. That means I am so wealthy that I can afford people to carry her from place to place. So my wife's tiny feet really acts as a sign of my own status and power and prestige. So the smaller the feet of the woman, it talks about really my wealth, my power, what I have. That's about me. And the thing is, you may judge people and say, well, that's ridiculous. But I noticed that everyone probably in this class, the people that are watching this video, are all wearing little shirts with different logos. And why do the logos matter? Because one logo indicates that this shirt costs this much and this one costs that much. Oh, and this was a special edition shirt that you had to get at this thing. We all wear clothing or items that indicate some type of status, wealth, or power. We all do it. Everyone does it. Everybody does it. And that is actually what this is. This is a sign of my power. My wife's feet are so small, they're not even functional. That means I am a rich, powerful man. And then there's the other part. Quite frankly, at this time in history, small feet were considered sexually attractive. And it's not just small feet, it's small feet that look like lotuses, which is a flower, and the way the feet would be curved in. That was considered very beautiful. And I will show you that. So, what is this process, Mr. Rico? Well, here's how it worked. You would often have girls, definitely below the age of 7, somewhere, 3, 4, 5. What they would do is their family would volunteer them for this, and typically speaking, this would not be a a girl from the poor class, although it could be she could be a farmer, but that would be a mistake because of there could be some problems. They're taking a risk. What happens? The girl gets volunteered, and they wrap her foot with a wet cloth in a very specific way. As the cloth dries, it kind of like suctions to her foot, and it almost becomes like a cast. As that foot as her foot's growing, which happens to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 year olds, as her foot starts to grow, the heel caves in on itself, and it keeps growing into this small little lotus shape. Now, if this is done incorrectly, the foot actually explodes in on itself, and the person dies a horrible death. Horrible death, probably a gangrene, a terrible death. But if it's done properly, then you get this specific shape that was considered very beautiful and to have a lot of status. The pain of this process cannot be overestimated. If you ever read about the experience of women in this history, so imagine from being a little girl to like about the age of 20, as their foot's still growing, the girls would have to cry themselves to sleep just constantly every night. They'd be constantly weeping because of the pain of their feet. Now, that is basically an x-ray of what the foot would look like if it's properly shaped. There's an actual real x-ray of the heel growing it, and you're probably like, why? I can't imagine this, Mr. Rico. Well, no problem. Let me show you what a bound foot looks like, because this was made illegal, but after it was made illegal in the 20th century, there were still women who had their feet bound. You can actually see how her heel and foot have grown next to each other, and her toes have wrapped under. Now, that said, this woman's feet would not be considered the perfect bound foot, because this lady had her feet bound, but she then had to, because this practice was made illegal, it was no longer had high status, so she had to work on those feet for her whole life. And you can actually see like how the toes have wrapped under. And this is the size of a shape differential between a normal foot and a bound foot. This is actually what I would tell you is like really close to when you read the sources of what a bound foot would ideally look like. It has the shape of the tiny little foot. It almost looks like the woman's wearing a high heel. And I've had some students in the past say it looks like a hoof. I don't think that's totally incorrect, but you can see how it like makes that very small shape. Oh my gosh, we're doing a Venn diagram. Woo! All right, so just to help you remember the difference between these, here's what I would put. I do this just to help me remember. So Tang dynasty only, they expand the empire. They become the largest geographical country. They had the first and only female ruler, Wu Zhao, and they reformed and re-brought back the civil service exam. Song dynasty, they're in charge of a smaller empire. They create paper money, movable type. And then if you look in the center of that, you have this improved agriculture, allows them to feed more people, and you really get a pretty strong economic and cultural boost. You get a lot of art from these periods. So this kind of gives you a breakdown of the difference between these two dynasties, which I know students really struggle with knowing the difference between them. Now, I will say this: the next dynasty is very different. So write down section 2, the Mongol conquest. So we've been kind of talking about or intimating the Mongols since really chapter 3, right? Chapter 3 notes end with the Great Wall of China and say there's this huge thing. Really, if you measure every wall, it's like 13,000 miles all over the place. It's not a contiguous wall. Why were the Chinese building this gigantic wall? What were they afraid of? Well, here it is. It's the Mongol people, which live in a region north of China's borders, today called Mongolia. Let's get into it. So, who are the Mongols? The Mongols are nomads, and nomads are people that move. And the reason why they move is they live in this area called the Eurasian steppe. It's probably time to talk about what a steppe is. A steppe, imagine a mountain that goes way, 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 way up into the sky, but instead of having a peak, the top part of the mountain is cut off and it's flat up there. And so it's very high up, but at the same time, it's not peaked, so you can have grasslands. And so it's cold. During the day, you can get a lot of sun, so it can actually be kind of warm during the day. But because it's so high up, it gets incredibly cold at night. And because it gets so cold, you don't get a ton of vegetation. You do get things like scrubs, you get brushes, you get certain types of grass and weeds, but you can't do agriculture up there. It's much too cold. And even to live up there would be very difficult. So, what do you mean, Mr. Rico? Well, imagine a place where it gets negative 50 at night. And that's really what it is like to live in on a step, at least one that's very high up. And so in order to survive up there, you have to have a very tough people. And these tribes that live up there are tough. And they're also small, right? The average person that live in the steppes, and even the animals, if you look at even their horses are tiny. There's not a lot of calories up there. And the thing about it is, so they live off of their animals, and anybody who lives based off of their animals, we call these pastoralists. So they have cows, very shaggy cows that they move from place to place, and they have very small horses that have long hair on them as well, and they have to constantly move, right? Because they can't grow agriculture, so they can't like start a stationary civilization. They have to constantly move their animals daily, so the animals have things to eat. And the reason why they're dependent on that is because they eat a lot of the meat of their own animals. Like what a Mongol would do if an animal dies is they would take it, they would put the meat under their saddle, and as they're moving up and down on it, they'd be tenderizing the meat, then they could eat it. They would also, when they got thirsty, would get off their horses and they would drink from it. Like they drink horse milk, the mares. And so their entire life revolves around their animals who they have to move constantly because when they eat all the grass in one area, they have to go to the next area. Well, Mr. Rico, if they have no homes, how do they even survive at negative 30 or 40 below at night? These people are so tough. Every night they have to set up these little tents called yurts, which are made of animal bone, and then the wrap of the yurt is made of animal skin. And at the top there's a hole because they have to burn a fire inside the yurt every night. And if they don't, they'd freeze to death. Well, what are they burning if there's no trees, Mr. Rico? They're burning animal dung because the animals eat scrubs and bushes and they poop out this grassy stuff, and then they have to burn that and they suck in those fumes every night because that's all there is. These people are tough, they are scary, they live in a difficult area, and that really makes them formidable people. Now, these tribes are tough people, and the Chinese are afraid of them. And I'll be honest, the Chinese mistreat them from time to time too. And there's a lot of tension between these tribes that are north of China. And what the Chinese will often do, because they don't want to have to like fight them, is they'll often assassinate their leaders, or the Chinese will cause division so that these northern Mongolian tribes fight each other. And because of that, they're never really, although the Chinese have concern and have fear of them, and they build these walls to keep them out of the Chinese regions, there's never a major problem from the Chinese perspective until this man is born. And this man, his name is Temujin. Temujin is a boy whose father, he's a Mongolian, his father is murdered by other Mongol tribe men, and he's orphaned. Now, this part of the story, we don't know if this is true or legend, but possibly his mother had him take an oath, a blood oath, to get revenge for his father's death. Now, I want you to imagine how difficult it would actually be to be an orphaned child in one of the hardest places in the world to live, in the 1300s even. Like, living in the 1300s is hard enough. Now do it as an orphan child on the Eurasian steppes. So Temujin is tough. And one day, as becomes a man, he starts to make a claim for the head of his tribe, and he takes over his tribe, but he's not satisfied with that. He starts then absorbing the other Mongolian tribes or takes them over by force. And when he finally takes all of them over, or they've joined him, he changes his name from Temujin to Genghis Khan or Genghis Han, which means universal ruler. We are no longer separate, we are one. This is really the worst case scenario for China. China's always feared the Tartar, the Mongol people, these Huns, as they would call them. They're afraid of them. And now they have one leader, and that leader has something in mind, and that is revenge and conquest of China. And so the other thing that you have to recognize about Genghis Khan is that he is brilliant. He's genius. He's very intelligent. And he's also as ruthless of a leader is that you've ever had, probably on planet Earth. He has no problem using brutality and terror to make people surrender. If you do surrender, actually the Mongols are fairly tolerant, but if you don't, there are situations where they will kill every single person in your city. They will slaughter everyone. There are places in the Middle East today, there are ancient cities that are still empty because the Mongols went through there like a desolating storm. They killed everybody. There's a story about Genghis Khan where he was trying to take over this one city. It was run by a Muslim sultan, and he actually at first sent gold and a messenger saying, "Hey, I'm taking over your city. You can still be the leader, but you have to pay me tribute." And this sultan was so offended that he took Genghis Khan's messenger, he took the gold and killed them. Genghis Khan comes back and he takes the city, he defeats his army, and he grabs the Sultan by the hair, brings him to the center of the city, has a pot of molten gold, so they're boiling gold or silver till it gets to its boiling point and it becomes liquid. And he takes it and he starts pouring it into the guy's eyes and his ears and his mouth. And he says, "You wanted my gold, now you can have it." And he pours it into him boiling. Imagine what it would be like to aspirate molten metal. And that's what happens. This guy dies a horrible death. But that's the point. Genghis Khan will send brutal messages: surrender or you will lose. Here's a quick picture. Just to show you how quickly the Mongols cut through the world. I mean, look at this. Like, in very short order, the Mongols take over. They start taking over large parts of China. They spread into Asia, or other parts of Asia to the east, and they go into southern parts of Europe, and they go into Eastern Europe, and they're everywhere, and they're hard to beat. And a big part of that is their tactics were brilliant. They lived off of those horses, so they're able to fire bow and arrow, like arrows from the horse without even slowing down. And they have these things called recurve bows that are super powerful. They can pretty much go through any armor at that time. And they use these specific tactics like feigned retreats. No one in the world is ready for this tactic. Again, we've talked about this in the past. When you have the right tactic at the right time, it's really hard to beat. And the Mongols are tough. Okay, so what were the Mongols like if they actually beat you? The Mongols again are tolerant. They'll let you keep your religion. They'll let you pretty much keep your governmental structure, but you have to pay them tribute. Again, tribute is when a weaker power pays a stronger power resources, often gold or whatever you have available. And the Mongols demand tribute. And they rip through Asia and parts of Europe like a storm. And the fact that they're tolerant is helpful because it means there's not going to be a lot of people revolting against their rule. But the fact that they're fearsome is what creates this thing called the Pax Mongolica. It means Mongol peace. The Mongol peace happens from about the year mid 1200s to the mid 1300s. They are so scary that people don't want to start conflicts during this period in between Europe and Asia, because if you do, you will get the eye of the Mongols on you and they will just destroy you. They will destroy you in the most horrible, sometimes personal ways possible. And so because of that, there's 100 years of peace. Now, the thing I've said before is you can have good people that end up doing bad things and bad people that do good things. You can have good events that create bad things. Well, the Mongol peace is awesome, right? Peace is great, except the Mongol peace is really how, and we've talked about the Black Plague. This is really how the Black Plague gets into Europe, right? Because now people can travel right from Asia to Europe, and they called it the Silk Road, just traveling from one place to another. And this is really how the plague ends up getting from Asia to Europe. If there had been a lot of conflict and banditry and things like that, it would have been hard, but because of that, it really allows it to move into Europe. And we've already talked about how it kills minimum of 30% of Europe's population. Some historians now say 60%. So now we got to talk about. In the past, we've talked about people like Alexander the Great, who was amazing, but his subsequent leaders were weak, so his empire falls apart. And we've talked about people like Charlemagne, where they're really strong, but the subsequent leaders aren't great. Genghis Khan has one heir that's pretty darn good. It's his grandson. His name is Kublai Khan, and Kublai Khan does something that even Genghis Khan was unable to do. So please write Section 3, the Mongol Empire. As Emperor of China, Kublai Khan encourages foreign trade. Let's get to it. Okay, so who's Kublai Khan? What's his deal? Why do we care about him? Kublai Khan does something even Genghis Khan couldn't do. Yeah, Genghis Khan took over the largest empire in human history, spanning from basically Japan all the way to Europe. But he never took over southern China, which is where the the power center of China is. That's where their government is. Kublai Khan does conquer all of China, and when he does, he is now emperor of China. Now he's not Chinese, but if you're ever going to take over a foreign power, it's a really good idea to name your whatever your new government off of the old government, so the people accept you. So rather than to say we are now the Mongol people of China, no, he says I'm creating a new dynasty. This is the Yuan dynasty. This is really it's a Mongol group controlling the Chinese government, but they're using a Chinese name, right? Yuan. They're using their name, their idea of it's a dynasty. And so the Yuan dynasty takes over China, and they get about this helps China because they get a big period of peace and prosperity. No one wants to mess with China because you know who's in charge of China? The Mongols, and they're scary, and that really allows them to focus on economics. Now, as great as Kublai Khan is, he has this failure, and it's super fascinating. He wants to take over Japan. Japan and China, as we've talked about in the past, have an ancient rivalry, right? So, but now is the time where China can finally get one over on Japan, and they launch this insanely huge invasion. This is going to be the largest amphibious, and what I mean by amphibious is from water to land invasion until D-Day in the 1940s. So he takes 150,000 Mongol warriors and horses and all the things that are required to supply an army of that size, and he puts it on a fleet of ships, and he heads right to Japan. Now, Japan, of course, is the era of the samurai, and the samurai are scary and tough, and they are tough warriors, and they are about to be challenged by one of the scariest powers on the planet. And let's be honest, this as powerful as the samurai were, they probably had really no chance against the Mongols. The Mongols and the samurai have fought before, and the Mongols have done really well against them. But something miraculous happens before they get there. This giant typhoon, this like hurricane, hits the fleet and it kills everyone. Japan was about to lose. Japan was about to become a subservient state to China. And Kublai Khan is so angry that what does he do? He puts together another massive invasion fleet. Hey, hey, when you do something and you fail once, go again. And he sends another massive invasion fleet with horse and men and all the supplies of war, and it also gets sunk by another typhoon. That's outrageous because there's only 400 or 500 miles between China and Japan. Like, this should have happened. And the Japanese pretty much knew that they were going to get wrecked. They are so grateful that they name the typhoon. They give it a proper name. They call the typhoon the kamikaze. Kamikaze translates to divine wind. The divine wind saved us from death. Now, if you know anything about World War II, you've heard the name kamikaze before, and that will come into play next semester. So what happens to Yuan dynasty? See if you've ever heard this story before. Over time, they start really overtaxing the Chinese. They just overtax, and because of that, there's a lot of resentment. Kublai Khan's successors are weak. And then there's a very simple, and it's kind of a strange thing, but because we don't think in terms of this. But in order to hold a territory, if you're a foreigner and you're trying to hold a territory, you have to have a large amount of people. And here's what I mean. Kublai Khan is living in China. And if he's going to have children, who's he likely going to marry or get with? He's likely to get with a Chinese woman because there's not as many Mongols. So imagine Kublai Khan marries a Chinese woman. And he has babies. Now their babies are 50% Chinese and 50% Mongolian. So okay, he has a son there, and his 50% Mongol son is really fired up about Mongol traditions. But then he's going to marry a woman, and his father dies, and his wives are likely to be Chinese as well. And now his kid's going to be what, 25% Mongol, probably not that connected to the Mongol. It's 75% Chinese and very connected to Chinese culture. And then his son, now we're 3 generations, his son's going to be 12.5% Mongol and, whatever, 87% Chinese. Now there's basically no combination to or connection to the Mongol culture anymore. And by doing this, the Chinese actually absorb the Mongol culture within their own borders. And that would take roughly, we think about 100 years, right? You go through three or so generations, 3 or 4 generations. And so they literally absorb them. And, high taxes, their dynasty is overthrown, and they're overthrown by the Ming. The Ming dynasty becomes this really important dynasty, and I'm sure people in this room have heard of that name. So let's talk about the Ming Dynasty. And the Ming Dynasty is what's considered the golden age of China. Like, because they get all the benefits of the peace that was made through the Mongol dynasty. No one wants to mess with China. China has tremendous wealth. They've always had natural resources. Now their empire's expanded, and they have power, and they have access to tribute. And what China builds is both a controversial part of history, and it's certainly fascinating. During this period, they commission what's called the treasure fleet. To understand what this is, look at the picture, because I can use words, but it won't explain. They build these gigantic 60 or so ships, and look at the picture, that are roughly 400 feet long. Well, how big is that? The little ship in the picture is Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria. And these ships are huge. They build 60 of these and another 200 support ships, and they build this gigantic fleet with tens of thousands of men on board, with giant cannons and mortars, ships that have never been built like anything like this on the planet. Nothing has existed, and they have they put a general in charge, as General Xi Jinping. He's in charge, and with this, China now starts to explore the oceans around them. And they explore up to 30,000 miles of ocean. And it's not just exploration. Let's be honest, they're now extracting more tribute. When the treasure fleet shows up and they have a ship as big as anything you've ever seen, and by the way, they have 60 more of those, you will give them whatever they want. And, there's stories that people would give them exotic animals, and they were growing plants on the ships and all this stuff. They become the greatest seafaring power on the planet. The insane thing here, if you're an American, is what you should realize is this is the part in history where China really should have discovered the Americas. Because all he has to do now is sail to the east, and then he would discover the Americas. And China has a massive population, so they have a huge amount of people that could easily have colonized North and South and Central America. World history is different. All they have to do now is sail east. But they don't do that. Why is China, and this is 1405, this is almost 100 years before Columbus. This should have happened. And they have all these fleets. They should have discovered the Americas, and all of history is different. Well, what happens here, and this is why a single person can change history. Like, there's this idea that, history is just a bunch of cycles and we can't control it. It's not true. The emperor, after using their power, and they project power, and they look around, the emperor comes to the conclusion that the world is made up mostly of barbarians and people that are savages and lower civilizations, and there's nothing outside of China's borders for China, and so forget it. And he orders that the treasure fleet is burned after decades. He just burn it all. We don't need to pay for the maintenance of this. And China now seals itself up in its own borders, and it will become isolated from the rest of the world. And the problem with that is China may be at its peak and may be the most civilized, advanced civilization technologically, culturally, economically. But when China goes into isolation, the rest of the world doesn't. And the rest of the world's going to keep advancing. And next time we come to China, it's going to look a little different. But just to show you a bigger picture of the treasure fleet, look at this. Look how insane that ship is. It's insane. Okay, guys, so what we're going to do now is we're going to finish up this unit with what's called Section 4. We're going to hit Japan. It's time to talk about what Japan's been doing. It says Japan's civilization is shaped by cultural borrowing from China and the rise of feudalism. What makes Japan's a fascinating civilization, but what makes them really that stands out in my mind is the Japanese have a hyper flexible culture. Probably that's due to the fact that they're an island people and you really have to work with what you get. The fact that they're like they're like a superpower in the world, they're a hyper advanced civilization, and the fact that they're on islands, which means they're restricted to resources, tells you a lot about the Japanese culture. But in order to understand the Japanese culture, we really have to understand their history. So roughly speaking, Japan lies east of China. As you can see a little map I put up there. Japan's name literally means land of the rising sun. And the idea of the rising or the morning sun is pretty prevalent in world history. The reason for that is if you're a culture, do you want to be known as a rising or morning sun or dawn, or do you want to be the setting sun or dusk or sunset? You don't want to be that because that means you're ending. We're just beginning. The closest neighbor to the closest neighbor to Japan is Korea. And you can look on the bottom part of that map I have up on there. You can see the Korea, especially South Korea and Japan, are really close. Now, regarding Japan and China, there's about 500 or so miles separating them. And the advantage to that is they are close enough that they can trade, but invasion is really hard, right? As Kublai Khan found out, it's really hard. 500 miles is pretty far via water to invade someone. Their geography is fascinating. Like your book says, there's 4,000 islands in their archipelago. An archipelago means, or if you're European, archipelagio. An archipelago is a chain of islands. The book says there's 4,000. Just so you know, in the last year or so, they've been using drones. Japan has 8,000 islands around it. Now they have their, 3 or 4 main islands that people live on, but in the world, when you have islands, you usually have lots of them, like these chains. Like to give you an example, the Philippines has over 2,000 islands. Now, when you look at the Philippines, you're like, oh, it's just a couple islands. No, it's not. There's the large land masses, then there's hundreds and thousands of little ones. Okay, now again, it's called an archipelago. So in early Japanese history, you get this religion that forms. It's called Shintoism, which means the way of the gods. And so Japan is very connected to forces of nature and their ancestors, which is kind of a little bit like some ancient Chinese religions. To understand Shintoism, or what is also known as an animism, is that spirits in this type of faith are not separated by, like, if you're Christian, the spirit world is like above and beyond you, right? Angels or demons, these are beings that are beyond you. They're spiritual, but they're also of a higher order than you. In this type of faith, Shintoism, spirits are just a part of the natural world. They're just a different type of nature, really. And that's why if you ever watch like anime and stuff, you'll see like spirits are often depicted as like animals or kind of like these grotesque chimeras, but they're no different. And they'll often call things demons that look like just like an elephant or something, an elephant spirit, because for them, these are just natural concepts, just an extension of the natural world. There's no founder to Shintoism, and a big part of it is it focuses on what you do, not so much what your beliefs are, which makes sense. If there's no founder to keep the coalesce specific tenets, it's really about your actions. Now we got to get to how their political structure goes over time. So around the year 400s, 400 AD, Japan is really a group of a series of feuding families, right? And the family that comes out on top is the Yamato clan. Clan is a group, and since they win, they elect that one of their family members is in charge of all of Japan, and he is emperor. And for the next 600 years or so, the emperor in Japan is going to have tremendous power. But what happens over time, around the 1000s, and this should sound familiar to you, they start to create this new form of government structure. And that is where large landowners start to create private armies to defend their territory and other people's territory. And these men are called shoguns. The shoguns are these people who control territory, and they expand their territories by fighting other shoguns. To do this, they have to have armies and private militaries that they contract out. And civilians live on their lands, and they give tribute, and they give up taxes, and they work for these people. What do we call systems like this? Because we've studied this once before, and it is now independently developed in Japan. We call that a feudal system. And the feudal system does develop in Japan. So, boom. This is feudalism. The idea that I would work your land for protection. And again, the shogun are, as I just put up there, they'd be like European feudal lords. But if we have European feudal lords, feudal lords hired men to fight for them. I wonder what the men that are called that fight for the shogun called. And that is where one of the most, I don't know, certainly one of the most prevalent cultural figures regarding ancient warriors comes about, and that's the samurai. The landowners needed bodyguards, they needed warriors, and they used these people called samurai. Samurai are highly trained Japanese warriors who train from basically the time they're boys. They learn it's a whole lifestyle. To be a samurai, it's their code of honor that they followed, which is called the Bushido, encapsulizes their entire life. The way they talk, the way they speak, the way that they interact with other people, the way they fight, the way they die, all of that. And the samurai are these massively culturally important figures. These warriors were to be treated with respect throughout society, and they were incredible fighters. By any standard, they are incredible fighters. And so the samurai and the kamikaze are the ones that are used to fight off the Mongol warriors. Now we're going to talk more about samurai here. Oh, and by the way, the Bushido is a lot like the code of what? Chivalry. Both knights. And what's so interesting, honestly, what's so fascinating is that how Europe and Japan both create feudalism, and they have structures, these warriors that are so similar. The knight with chivalry and the samurai with the Bushido. Let's talk a little bit about the samurai's weapons, because I know we're all guys and we like weapons. Their long sword is called the katana, and I have one in the room, and I'm sure you've seen it. The katana is probably the greatest cutting sword ever made by humans, and the reason for that is simple. It has one cutting edge. It has the one. It's only bladed on one side. All the cutting power goes to that side. But what makes it so exceptional is Japan does not have a lot of access to resources, iron and steel. They have to, with what they have, they have to make sure it's great. So their samurai blacksmiths would take this metal and they would heat it and fold it and heat it and fold it and heat it and fold it and heat it and fold it. And this painstaking process of doing this over and over and over again would make sure the steel was so pure that it would be incredibly strong blades. Modern scientists have looked at the purity of samurai blades from like the 1200s, and some of them are 99.8% pure steel. And that's because, unlike in Europe where they have plentiful resources and they can make weapons quickly to go into battle, they have to utilize everything to its best. So samurai swords were made really well. They have a secondary sword called the wasashaki, and that's on their side. You can often see it sticking off. That's a medium length sword. And then all samurai would usually carry a blade called the tanto blade. The tanto blade was a utilitarian shorter sword, and they would use it, like a police officer has a backup weapon. It's that same idea. And it was also used for utility as well. Samurais themselves had really high status in society. You know, regular people were to actually give them great respect. Now, and by the way, if you have questions, this is a great time. I'm not going to cover it here, but if you want to ask me about ninjas, ask me about it because this is the time where you got ninjas became a part of Japanese culture. Okay, so tell me a little bit more about this. So every part of their garb matters. They wear a mask called the menori, and here's some examples of it. The menori has two purposes. One, obviously, it is to protect the face of the warrior, but the other is actually to intimidate. A big part of samurai culture, because they were naturally revered, people were afraid of them. And the mask would look grotesque, like they have these demonic faces. Or look at the one in the center, it's totally straight faced. How scary would that be to fight someone who has no emotion? So, when intimidation, trying to scare the opponent, into even delaying for a second, made all the difference, especially in ancient battle. So, look at this quote I have up here from an actual samurai. One finds life through conquering the fear of death within one's mind. Separate one's mind from all forms of attachment, make a charge, and conquer the opponent in one decisive slash. Try to kill with one blow. There's just another example of a menori. That mustache, of course, is horsehair. Now, this is the last part of this I'm going to cover. It's just because there's a lot of confusion about this. Since all of their lives revolve around honor, to lose one's honor was a big deal. And so there is a way that if a samurai lost their honor, they could gain that honor back through a ritual called seppuku. And so what this would be if Mr. Rico was to lose his honor is I could declare that I was going to commit seppuku. I would pick a kashaku who's my second, and I would give my kashaku my katana sword, and then I would sit in front of a group. I would go through a ritual of cleansing my body, and then I would sit in front of a group. Often there'd be witnesses. I would take off my top robe so my chest was exposed. I would take my tanto blade. I would go right below my abdomen, push it in, slice down, turn, cut across my stomach, and go up. And when I do that, it should release my guts, and I should die very quickly. Now, the thing is, that's really incredibly difficult to do, and so I might get stuck and start screaming while I'm trying to cut myself, and then at that point my kashaku would then cut my head off. The purpose for this, though, and the reason why you would do this, is by doing this act I would get my honor back in death, and that would also mean it would extend that honor back to my family. That tells you how seriously honor was taken um, by the samurai in their code of Bushido. And I'll be honest, it's actually very similar to chivalry. Knights had similar, they wouldn't commit ritualistic suicide, but knights would do whatever they could to keep their honor as well. I have a video link to this, so if you want to see a movie that depicts this, go ahead and watch it. If you have any questions about this unit, let me know. That is Ancient Asia.